cups of coffee intake. So 4 servings per day of coffee intake. For these women, they actually had a 20% increased risk of early pregnancy miscarriage.
Wow.
So you can see that this is why we also advise women, if you're trying to conceive, you also want to pay attention to your caffeine intake.
So for those listeners who tuned into the previous episode on the I'm Thinking of Having a Baby podcast, we covered 5 changes or habit changes that you need to make for a healthy conception and pregnancy. Now, I've got Catherine from Brisbane. She's a fertility dietitian, and you specialize in IVF. Is that right?
That's right, Hannah. So I am a fertility dietitian. I'm based in Brisbane, Australia. So I mainly work with women and couples trying to conceive, but I also largely see couples who are preparing for their IVF treatment.
Very valuable. Wow. Because on this podcast, we're talking about another habit, which is so common, specifically about caffeine. Now, are you a big coffee drinker?
I have to admit, I do have my 1 coffee a day every morning.
That's not a lot. Oh, funny.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about coffee, it's absolutely one of my favorite topic, because it's one of the top questions that women always ask me, how much coffee can I drink? So I'm so glad that being in this podcast today to share what I know with all of you here.
Yeah, that's great, because obviously you've done a bit of research around it. So why don't we dive in then to the first question? Because like you, I also have a lot of clients asking, what can I drink? Is coffee okay, or caffeine in general? And our recommendations differ while you're trying to conceive versus once you're pregnant. So can you tell me, so why is caffeine something that we should be aware of in planning a pregnancy, and how that's different from then when we're pregnant?
Sure. So let's take a step back. So what is caffeine? So caffeine is present in many drink and food, such as in your coffee, black tea, or green tea, for example. Now, caffeine is actually a stimulant, so which means after 5 or 30 minutes after having it, it actually increasing your brain and nervous system activity and raises your cortisol and adrenaline hormones in your body. So in small doses of caffeine, it can make you feel more alert and focused. But for some people, they can be highly sensitive to caffeine as well. So what it means is having a small amount can also make them feel a little bit more anxious, difficulty in sleeping, or having digestive issue. Now, talking about if you are preparing for pregnancy, or if currently pregnant or breastfeeding, too much caffeine can actually be harmful, because research shows that it does associate with adverse pregnancy complications. So there is actually certain limit when it comes to your caffeine intake during this period of time.
Okay, so to clarify, you're saying when you're trying to have a baby, when you're pregnant, and when you are breastfeeding, we need to be aware of how much caffeine we're getting from all these kind of sources, the tea, the coffee, and the food.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's right. So generally speaking, for general population, so a typical adult, the recommendations advice that is to keep to 400 milligram per day, which is equivalent to if you drink espresso coffee. That's roughly about, I would say, 3 to 4 cups of espresso coffee a day. But if you are trying to conceive during pregnancy or breastfeeding, the recommendation basically is 50% less, so no more than about 200 milligram per day, which is really, if you're looking at espresso, that's equivalent to about 1 espresso coffee a day.
Yep, definitely. And it depends how strong your coffee is. So you've given espresso. What if you have, say, instant coffee?
Yeah, so instant coffee, the caffeine contains a little bit less. If you're looking at typically, say, if you add 1 teaspoon of instant coffee powder, it's roughly about 80 milligram per cup. So put it that way, so that would translate to roughly about, I would say, 2 or 3 cups a day, depending, again, the amount of caffeine content can vary depending on the brand.
Yes. So it's tricky though. If you're thinking 200 milligrams in total per day from all sources, if you drink coffee and that's all the caffeinated food or beverage that you have, that's fine. But what if you drink tea? So sometimes I suppose the real world picture would be women need to think about what your typical drinking habits are if it's caffeinated beverages, and if you have chocolate as well, how to sort of balance it so that 200 milligrams, which isn't actually a lot if you're thinking 1 coffee, they're quite tricky, right, to manage?
Yeah. So I suppose the first step is you want to really think about in your diet, what are the caffeinated foods? So we always focus on coffee, but like Hannah, you mentioned that if you drink black tea, green tea, and don't forget about soda or energy drink,
Yes.
or even, chocolate bar, energy bar. So these other food items may also contain caffeine as well. So it all add up. Absolutely, we need to factor in all the food source and beverage we take.
So maybe choose your poison, pick your favorite. So what you're saying is there is such a thing as too much caffeine. And you've told us what our limit is when we're pregnant breastfeeding, about 200 milligrams. And so would you recommend, say you mentioned anxiety, and some women might feel more susceptible to the effects of caffeine than others? Would you recommend on a case-by-case basis some women maybe limit their caffeine intake altogether?
Yeah, it's really a good question. If you know that you can't tolerate caffeine, just general basis, definitely I would advice is to try to avoid caffeine as much as you can. Cases that I tend to see that is, say for example, if I got clients who drink a lot of coffee, it actually trigger a lot of reflux. They may not even know of. So then my first step working in terms of reflux is to really cut down that caffeine intake. Same for that level of anxiety as well. So perhaps you want to try it out to cut down your caffeine, maybe down to the minimum amount, and see whether it does make a difference to your body.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you mentioned earlier on the adverse effects of caffeine. Could you go into a bit more detail about what the research tells us about the effects that caffeine can have on a developing baby?
Yeah, so in terms of the caffeine impact and pregnancy health risks, the research is actually pretty strong. There was a current review study found that caffeine consumption during pregnancy was related to an increased risk of miscarriage, stillbirth, low birth weight, and also having a small gestational age baby. Now, what is interesting as well is it appears that it is dose dependent. So what the research highlighted is for every 100 milligram per day of increment with your caffeine consumption, it seems like the risk of miscarriage as well in that early pregnancy phase also increased by 14%. So this is also why some experts also argue that women should also avoid completely with caffeine intake, because suggests that there's no safe levels of coffee intake during pregnancy, which is, I thought that's very interesting.
I agree with you. And it's quite clear, you're saying in the research, that the more caffeine we have, the greater the risk of miscarriage. And obviously no pregnant woman wants to experience that, stillbirth, small for gestation. You want the healthiest baby possible. So that's just for pregnancy. But caffeine prior, like if you're conceiving, you'd still recommend, say, stick to the 200 milligrams in the lead up to conception. Then once you find out you're pregnant, maybe it's up to each individual woman to decide how much caffeine they're going to have. But you're saying actually zero caffeine is the best option, given that the effects could potentially, the risks rather increase with the more caffeine that you do have?
Yeah, so I definitely, the first step is we want to keep that overall caffeine intake down to the safety limit. And I always explain to my patient is, look, the research showing that the more caffeine you have, the higher risk, and it's up to them to decide. I'll always give them a choice whether or not they want to avoid completely during pregnancy. But in my experience, most pregnant women usually will, just try to avoid everything. Like they just want to have the healthiest baby possible as they can. Now, in terms of caffeine and fertility, so for all of you listening in, trying for baby as well, it's pretty interesting as well when we're looking into research. There was a study published in 2018, which consists of more than 10,000 women. What they found as well, there is a positive association between pre-pregnancy coffee consumption with the risk of early pregnancy loss. So it seems like it actually also increased the early miscarriage risk as well. Now, what is also interesting to know is that in terms of the amount, how much the women actually drinking, so they're actually looking at for over 4 cups of coffee intake, so 4 servings per day of coffee intake. For these women, they actually had a 20% increased risk of early pregnancy miscarriage.
Wow.
So you can see that this is why we also advise women, if you're trying to conceive, you also want to pay attention to your caffeine intake.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm not sure that a lot of people out there really understand the effects of caffeine intake specifically on fertility and pregnancy. That's amazing. I mean, we do have an understanding that, you know, too much coffee can lead to more anxiety, and that's a big problem. But wow, if that's right, if you were trying for a baby, really being aware of it, that's amazing. Okay, so if you're not drinking a lot of coffee, you know, you make that decision yourself that you're going to try and limit it. What on earth can you have that are caffeine-free alternatives?
Hannah, just one more point as well I want to share with all of you here is with men as well. So high doses of caffeine, right, can actually also impact on male fertility and sperm DNA damage as well. But it's interesting, again, not so much on the coffee from, you know, the caffeine from the coffee, but for men, it's actually more on soda and the energy drink.
Yes.
So it's not just the women always have to do the work. Absolutely, for them, you know, your male partner as well, they also need to change their eating habits as well. Now, in terms of we're looking at, okay, what are the caffeine, you know, free alternative option? So a lot of people also ask me, what about decaffeinated coffee? Are they okay to drink? So one important point is decaffeinated coffee actually still contain caffeine. Right, so a lot of people think that, oh, it's actually completely caffeine-free, but in fact, they actually still contain a very small amount of caffeine in there. So, you know, if you do go down to decaf coffee, make sure that you still watch out for how much you are drinking. When I looked into study as well, Hannah, I found that there was one study also shows that when women, this is talking about when they're trying to conceive, pre-pregnancy consumption, they found that for women who drink caffeinated and decaffeinated coffee, they are actually an associated increased risk of early pregnancy loss. So what the study highlighted suggests that there may be other component in the coffee itself can actually increase that risk of miscarriage. So it's not just the caffeine amount. So
no, we don't know what those components are at this point.
We don't know. So again, pay attention with how much decaf coffee you are drinking. And the second, the second caffeine alternative that I always got asked from my patient is kombucha. So kombucha is actually made with black or green tea. So it does still contain caffeine. So make sure that you don't overindulge kombucha as well. And one thing also to note that if you are currently pregnant, kombucha is actually not suitable to drink because potentially it might have a mixture of different types of bacteria and yeast in there, and just never know whether it's safe for you and your baby. And kombucha is not pasteurized as well, so we definitely not encourage pregnant women to consume.
Yeah. And the other aspect of kombucha is it's a fermented product, so the chances are that there is some alcohol in it as well. It's minute, but there is still some alcohol, and obviously the recommendations for having any alcohol in pregnancy is let's keep that to an absolute minimum, 0 if possible. I know when I was pregnant, kombucha was my go-to. I was trying to reduce how much caffeinated beverages I had, so I really enjoyed, or alcoholic beverages actually. I was trying to not drink alcohol when I was trying to conceive. So what do you do when you go out for a beverage? I was choosing kombucha, but then I got pregnant and I'm like, now what? Kombucha, kind of coffee, kind of alcohol, stuck.
I actually have a few options for you to choose from. So one of the things that I would suggest is, okay, if you like a bit of fruity flavor, you can actually make your own fruit infused tea. So you can cut up, like say, chop up strawberries or berries, a little bit of lime, for example, just make it like a fruity infused tea, basically. But this day, you can also get a fruit infused tea bag as well. And then you just put it in your drink. You can make it cold or even warm as well, depending on how you want to enjoy them. My second favorite is you can also make like a green protein smoothie. So you can mix up spinach, cucumber, frozen pineapple or mango, and add a little bit of pure protein powder so that it makes you feel refreshing as well, and it's nutritionally packed. My third favorite as well, and a little pregnant women quite enjoy as well, is a bit of lemongrass ginger tea. So you can actually blend it up a small amount and make it in a warm tea as well. So this is particularly very soothing, especially if you feel a bit nausea in the early phase of your pregnancy as well. So that's one of the popular drinks.
So how would you make it? How much lemongrass? How much ginger?
Oh, very, very small amount, because you don't want to be too spied up with all these ingredients. So
Yeah.
really just, I would probably say that just, chop it up like a 1 little teaspoon. Yeah, and you can put it in your blender, just blend it to very fine texture, and
Yep.
just put in a tea bag basically. Just put in warm water.
Yep.
So that can be quite a soothing and refreshing tea.
Hey, that's such a great idea. Because I mean, you could buy sort of ginger tea, like lemon and ginger teas on the market. That's an option. But I love it, making your own lemongrass. That's really cool. And if you have one of those tea strainers, you can just steep it. Oh, delicious. And I've had some clients do mint tea as well, like mint from their garden. They'll just put that in some hot water. It's not quite the same. I get it. It doesn't give you that energy boost that you need in the morning, that kind of why we reach for coffee or why we choose alcohol for the relaxation. It's not quite the same. But I suppose if you've got that perspective, look, I'm trying to do the best for my baby. I'm trying to make sure that I can create or ensure that this environment my baby's growing in is the healthiest. It's totally worth it, especially if you're looking at the risks being miscarriage, stillbirth, or small for gestational age baby. Each dietitian will work with their clients to find out their preference and come up with excellent substitutes so that you don't feel like you're missing out too much. Now, there was one that I wanted to mention as well. And we think of, if we're talking about caffeine, reducing caffeine, we often think of Rooibos because it's naturally caffeine free. And some women would say, well, what about Rooibos? Can I have that instead? And it's interesting when it comes to herbal teas, and Rooibos is an example of that. There are some that are safe to have and shown to be safe to have, and there are others that are not shown to be safe to have. And unfortunately, Rooibos, red bush tea, is not currently known to be safe during pregnancy. So if you are pregnant and looking for a caffeine-free alternative, unfortunately, we put a cross next to Rooibos as well. There are several herbal teas that are safe to have in pregnancy, and what I will do is add the list of those into the show notes so that you can see, here are some that you can pick from, some tasty tea options if you're looking for a tea alternative there. So let's talk about chocolate. That is a favorite of many women.
Yeah, chocolate, it's also contains caffeine because it's made out of cocoa bean. Although it's a smaller amount, the darker the chocolate, the more cocoa content. So meaning the amount of caffeine will increase as well. And again, it will vary depending on the product you buy. So one of the tips I can give is, so always look at ingredient list. So that's where you can actually identify how much the actual cocoa powder, as an active ingredient in there. But also to take note that some product, I noticed that they actually also added additional caffeine powder separately in the chocolate itself. So
right.
Be very careful. That's why we always want to read the ingredient list to find out exactly what goes into that product.
Yeah, good one. No, I didn't realize that they add extra caffeine into chocolate. Is that to make it kind of an energy chocolate choice?
Yeah. So one of the elements that contain in chocolate is why do we feel, happy or energy lifting whenever we eat chocolate? Is because there was something called theobromine. It helped to elevate the mood and energy. But some product, they can also add in just a little bit of caffeine in there as well, just to give you that extra, again, energy boost as well. So if you're trying to conceive during pregnancy, I will always just take extra precaution in terms of food safety. Just read the ingredient list and food label.
Good one. Now, do you have any guidance as to, and it's going to be a rough guess here, but to the amount of caffeine contained in chocolate so that we can get an idea of how much is safe to have, how much might be a bit too much?
Yep. So we're looking at in a typical dark or milk chocolate bar, it's approximately about 10 milligram of caffeine per 50 gram of chocolate bar. So roughly about, say, 3 or 4 square size, it has about 10 milligram of caffeine. So this is not a lot compared to a cup of espresso coffee. So I always will advise my patient, look, if it's something that you enjoy from time to time, it is okay to have maybe 2 square size of chocolate, but certainly you don't want to overindulging it at one go.
Yes. Yes, that's a really good point. I mean, I do know people that in pregnancy, because of the nausea, because they're so tired, because there's nothing else in the pantry to grab, you know, chocolate is the go-to. And some people find that they just eat a lot more than they probably should. And being aware, though, of the caffeine content and the effects of it is really important. But yeah, you're right. We're not saying don't have chocolate. I mean, that's criminal.
Yeah. So yeah, I do think that's okay to enjoy it, but just, you know, pay attention to the portion size.
Right. And it's not a, you know, bad point you're making anyhow, right? We're talking about a treat food here. We should enjoy it. It's a part of a healthy diet, but it has its place as a treat food. And so again, we're talking about healthy pregnancies. And so chocolate is also, you know, delicious, but it's high in sugar. And so we're wanting to ensure that we're not over consuming it and that we've got a good balance of those kind of baby loving nutrients as well, that everything is just sort of in its right place. Hey.
Yeah, 100%, Hannah.
So good. Well, that sort of wraps up my questions. Did you have anything else that you wanted to comment on?
Yeah, I suppose that, look, if you are trying to get pregnant, or if you're currently already pregnant, so definitely have a look at, like I suggest, the first step is to look at your diet or beverage that you drink. Just kind of think back, okay, with the food items we mentioned in this episode, is there anything that you more frequently consume, and you really want to just keep it into that safety limit? I suppose that's the first step.
Yeah, definitely. And if in doubt, and you want to just ensure that your diet is the best possible, you know, thing it can be, where you're really taking care of yourself and baby. Catherine and I and other fertility dietitians, I mean, we are so passionate about helping you get there and sort of making it really clear so that you know what you can have a lot of, and what to maybe to limit, but all within your preferences, your tastes, your likes. So we look forward to working with you. But Catherine, I'd just like to say again, thank you so much for your time, your expertise. It's been a privilege to have you on the show.
Thanks, Hannah. I really enjoyed coming on the show.
Yay. Perfect. All right.